The Brooklyn Nets, 32-50, missed the play-in, fired their head coach Jacques Vaughn during the season. He's now replaced by Jordi Fernandez, who was the head coach of Canada during the Olympics and also was formerly an assistant in Sacramento and other places. And during the offseason, the sort of big news when it came to the Nets is they traded for their picks back from Houston. They paid a pretty hefty price. They paid some Phoenix picks and swaps to get their pick back for this upcoming draft and next year's draft. But it allowed them also to sort of start proper rebuild because Brooklyn did not have any of its own picks going forward. So now they do, and that allows them to be part of this upcoming draft. And it's supposedly a very deep and loaded draft, so hopefully Brooklyn can get their cornerstone guy. They formerly thought that that cornerstone guy maybe was going to be Mikal Bridges, but he turned out not to be so good. The Nets are actually slightly worse with Bridges on the floor last season, which is kind of alarming for a guy who looked like he was going to take that all-star leap. But he's now out. They traded him to the Knicks for a giant haul of draft picks. So clear theme here: tank, get draft picks, and go from there. The one problem with the idea, most media members seem to think that the Nets are going to be 15th this season and maybe the worst record in the NBA. The one problem I see with that is that there's still a little bit too much talent on the roster for that. You looked at Cam Johnson, Dorian Finney-Smith, Ben Simmons, Dennis Schroeder, Nick Claxton, Cam Thomas, Day'Ron Sharpe. Like that's still a pretty talented group of players. And for some of those guys, trades need to happen. I'm looking at Dorian Finney-Smith. I'm looking at Cam Johnson. Now, Dorian Finney-Smith might be a little tricky. He has a player option, so you're kind of getting him on a rental if you're a contending team. But Cam Johnson on the other side is a little bit overpriced with his contract. He's a good player, but not worth the money that he was paid. So, trading those guys is definitely going to be tricky. But if you're Brooklyn, you want to try and get them out the door. Ditto for Dennis Schroeder, but he, as great as he is, both in the Olympics and during his time in the NBA, and was great for Brooklyn last season, he doesn't really have that much trade value either. So getting rid of these guys is going to be the real challenge. And then the motherload of challenges is Ben Simmons, who kind of floundered towards the end of his time in Philly, got traded to Brooklyn, has not been good in Brooklyn, has not been healthy in Brooklyn, says all the right things about being healthy and ready to go, and is never actually. And to me, Ben is done being a true all-star player. Like he has the talent, he has the size, athleticism, but he doesn't put it together both mentally and physically. And in previous years, it was a much bigger problem because his contract is so albatross and expensive. This year, there's a possibility that some team takes a flyer on him, but I think it's more likely than not that Ben Simmons' contract is just going to expire, get off the books, and then next year Brooklyn can really focus on a rebuild. But even if all of those guys were gone, there's still decent players on the team. Cam Thomas, there's a lot of stats that sort of indicate that Cam Thomas has a Devin Booker, Anthony Edwards trajectory. I'm not going to go that far. I do think he can average 25, maybe 30 points a game in the league someday. All star is certainly a possibility. I think it might take another year or two. Like his passing got better last season. His defense needs to be a little improved. He's a little undersized as a guard, as far as a guard goes, especially if you play him at the two guard instead of the point guard. And he needs to be a little bit more efficient, but the signs are there that maybe someday he's Devin Booker and Anthony Edwards, but I'm not going to just assume that happens. And then there's also Nick Claxton, who is probably never going to be a superstar. All star is also somewhat unlikely, but he's a very talented player. He's still young. I think he's only 25. He has a good feel offensively. Still needs to work on his free throws, and he's still not a perimeter threat, like a 3-point threat, but he does have the ability to run as a focal point for an offense, run handoffs, dribble fakes, the whole 9 yards. An elite defensive player in terms of switches and shot blocking. Needs to be a little bit better rebounding, but he's still just a valuable asset to have if you're trying to build for the future. And if you build around them too, that's a pretty good nucleus to start with. And if you get a draft pick, a high draft pick, that's even better for the next year. Get rid of the vets and then sort of figure out what you have the rest of the guys. You have Day'Ron Sharpe, who is a solid player. I don't think All Star's ever in his future, but he's an elite offensive rebounder, and his defense is solid. If you can ever get his offensive feel working and his 3-point shot, maybe you have something there. Ditto for Summer League MVP Jalen Wilson. He certainly has potential to be a solid role player for many years. Noah Clowney had a terrific rookie season, second half of the rookie season. Usually, second half numbers are a little misleading and grain of salt, but if he can replicate that success during this season, that's something as a big stretch for. And then you have to figure out as the Nets what you have with Dariq Whitehead, who missed most of last year. Didn't look good in the offseason in the summer league, but if he can get back to form, maybe something there. And that's a sort of solid young core. Maybe you keep some vets around like Dennis Schroeder. Maybe you don't. You figure out what you have with newly acquired former lottery pick Zaire Williams. I'm not convinced that he's going to be some all star ever. I think he can be a solid role player. He certainly has the athleticism, but he doesn't stay healthy. And he was kind of inconsistent offensively, which is why Memphis got rid of him. Now he's eligible for a rookie extension. I don't think he's going to get it, but it's worth a flyer. Who's not worth a flyer though is Killian Hayes. Killian Hayes was an absolute bust in Detroit. He's a guy that you sign if you're trying to tank. I'm not saying he's going to necessarily be part of the Brooklyn roster going forward long term, but I just don't think he's worth that flyer so much. So why bother with the slot? But yeah, that's sort of the nucleus. I think the team could try and compete for the play-in if they really wanted, but it doesn't really make sense, especially since they have their own first round pick, and you want that pick to be in the lottery. So if I'm Brooklyn, trade as many guys as you can. Figure out what you have with Cam Thomas and Nick Claxton if you can develop them to be all stars. Figure out what the rest of the young guys can contribute. Draft high next year and go from there. But for this season, I think more likely than not, Brooklyn is in that sort of 13 to 15 range in the East, maybe 12. And you sort of have to figure out again, can you get a first round pick for Cam Johnson? Can you get a first round pick for Dorian Finney-Smith? Because otherwise, with Ben Simmons looking for his next contract, with the vets looking to have success in their next contract, there's going to be that sort of butting heads of stylistic winning versus losing. So if I'm Brooklyn, you know, you've made the first step with Mikhail trade and the draft pick trade, and that's good. But now you have to take that next step to truly tank so that you can start completely from the ground up and get the sort of core that will eventually get you a championship.